What is a crisis? It's a word that we use every day, but in some ways it's very relative. What's a big, huge crisis for one person could be just a minor problem and run-of-the-mill for somebody else. In this session, I want to think about what I mean by the word crisis. If we want to talk about crises, we have to speak a common language. And so I want to begin by thinking the unthinkable, things that can go wrong, and what would we consider to be a crisis and what wouldn't we. Then I want to think about some of the common characteristics that define a crisis and the different types of crisis we can encounter. I then want to conclude by very briefly thinking about this term crisis management that's often used and suggest a very simple model or framework we can use to capture the process. So, to begin, let's try thinking the unthinkable. Wherever you're sitting watching this, maybe it's on a train, maybe it's in the workplace, I want you to think about your own home. What types of things could be going wrong now while you're sitting there listening to me? What types of crisis might affect your home when you're at work, away on holiday, whatever it might be? Just pause this video for a few seconds and jot down as many examples as you can think about. What sort of crisis might your home be encountering? How did you get on? Well, here's some of the things you might have come up with that came to my head straight away. Your house might be on fire. It might be flooded. It could be there's a raging storm and it's totally being destroyed as we speak. Perhaps there's mysterious people with masks on robbing your house right now. Or maybe it's something simple like squatters or a burst pipe. Do you really know what's going on in your home now? And which of those things and other things you might have thought of would you consider to be a real crisis? Don't mean to depress you by getting you to think about your home that way, but hopefully you'll get my point. A burst pipe can be messy and a major inconvenience, but is it a crisis? Is it as big a crisis as, say, a robbery or a fire? Think about that. Let's repeat that exercise now. Supposing, and you may well be, you're sitting at home watching this or on the beach somewhere or whatever. You're away from the office. What similar types of things, what crises could be affecting your business? Pause the video again and see what you can come up with. It's perfectly possible that in that exercise you came up with some of the same things again. Fires and floods turn up a lot, for instance, robberies and so on. But businesses, depending on the sector, can be prone to all sorts of things. You might have a major power failure, an IT outage. Might be a human problem, such as sabotage from competitors or from within, industrial unrest. Depending on where you work, it could be something very, very dramatic and newsworthy in inverted commas. Something like a terrorist attack or a major political scandal. Some of those, again, some businesses would regard as a crisis and others would see as perfectly run-of-the-mill. But hopefully now you can see the types of things that when we talk about crisis management and crises in general, that we're really referring to. The things in your lists that you probably came up with as constituting a crisis of one form or another probably shared some common characteristics. Generally, for instance, when we think crisis, we think about low probability events, things that are just not going to happen every day, not the run-of-the-mill, I must deal with all those emails before I get started on something productive today type of morning. So low probability but high impact. The consequences could be very severe. Then we tend to think of it as a crisis rather than a major or serious problem. Other things about crises, well, even with something like a fire, the causes can be unclear, the long-term effects might be. How did that happen? How quickly can it be repaired or rebuilt? So, lack of clarity in causal relationships. The one thing that probably defines a crisis better than another is the idea of needing a swift response or rapid decision making. We tend to associate these fast processes with crises. The crisis response. The event happens, we must swing into action immediately, no room for hesitation or delay. It's that serious. And finally, the last characteristic. We might not know quite what to do. There's often a lack of clarity, immediately at least, in how we should respond and what the best course of action might take, simply because we don't know enough about the other things in that list. The causes and the longer term effects, for instance, the extent of damage in a fire. We're not sure immediately exactly what the right course of action is. That's something we have to try to plan for. So what types of things could we come up with if we had to come up with a typology, for example, different classes of crisis? What might we come up with there? This is a fairly general list. It's by no means exhaustive, but you'll find these themes in most of the literature on crisis management. Natural disasters are probably the most obvious. These days, internet-related crises tend to attract a lot of attention. Terrorist attacks are pretty obvious. But there are other more business-related ones, globalisation and outsourcing crises, for example, environmental problems, and maybe just human organisational crises, very serious problems or crises. Sometimes it's difficult to tell. Let's think for a few moments about these different types of crises. Natural disasters, pretty obvious. Very often, a flood or a hurricane is a quirk of geography. Now, in business, we can do things to mitigate this. We can relocate, for example, if a plant is destroyed, or we find that we're getting recurrent crises of this nature because we've located in an unwise place. But the longer-term economic impacts of that can be far more severe. We also, with natural disasters, get disaster packages, as I like to call them. If we think about Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, well, this caused a lot of damage, mainly with damage to property and flooding. But actually, the more serious longer-term problems were the consequences of that hurricane hitting. For example, power outages caused far more serious disruption than the storm itself, affecting homes, industry, hospitals, emergency responses, and so on. There were problems of lawlessness, almost as many people injured as a result of crime than from the hurricane itself. There was a real breakdown in civil obedience as a result of that hurricane. And of course, loads of public health issues, political scandals surrounding the construction of buildings, and so on. So what begins as a quirk of geography, a hurricane, becomes far more complicated. Then there's the wonderful world of the World Wide Web. Internet-related crises have been around pretty much since the start of the technology. And remember, the internet itself was created because of worries about a crisis, nuclear war, and the network of computers came from that. Internet-related crises, again, can take lots of different forms. One of the most interesting is perhaps the symmetry in information that's now developing. Organisations used to know more about themselves than their customers did, far more. Now it's not the case. Sometimes it's the other way around, particularly if there are pressure groups who want to attack or discredit an organisation in some way. Check out websites like WalmartWatch.com, where any little thing to do with Walmart is reported online, sometimes accurately, sometimes who knows. The point is it's there, and it's a voice, and an organisation needs to be aware of it. Many organisations take the threat of consumer revenge very, very seriously. There are very sophisticated monitoring units in organisations such as Southwest Airlines, Dell Computers, people just monitoring social networking sites like Facebook, Twitter, and so on. looking for signs of customers causing disruption, because they can escalate and seriously damage a brand. And then there's perhaps the most common one, cybercrime. Well, most commonly reported. It's newsworthy, again, as crises often are. Hacking stories, fraud, identity theft, paranoia. It's all there on the news pretty much any day of the week. All of those things can cause a crisis. Terrorism? Well, since 2 Twin Towers collapsed, we've all seen the serious consequences of that. And 9/11 was particularly interesting because it was perhaps the most graphic example of the changing face of terrorism. Collateral damage is becoming bigger and bigger every time, and the weapons being used are more sophisticated and in many ways more routine. It's not bombs anymore, it's jets being flown deliberately into buildings with devastating consequences. In another way, political motives behind terrorism, although they're still there, are ceding to extremism of one form or another. Sometimes political, but very often religious extremism of one brand or another. And because of those different dimensions, religion rather than, say, political support for a cause, the geographies of terror are widening all of the time. That makes threats harder for us to spot. And of course, well, the business impact of 9/11, we're still feeling it now, many years on, because it's not just collateral damage, it's not just human costs, it's far more than that. It's an economic crisis too. As the world becomes more complex, we get crises involving globalisation, supply chains, particularly outsourcing problems. In 1984, the Bhopal disaster in India, a chemical leak, cost 2,500 lives, many, many more casualties. The biggest business casualty in all that was Union Carbide, who owned and branded the plant. Actually, if you dissect that crisis and look below the surface, Union Carbide had a 51% stake in that plant. 49% of it was a local partner cutting corners on safety and with an appalling record. That highlights issues of governance and globalisation and strategic partnerships. Also in India, there was a crisis affecting both Pepsi and Coca-Cola, leading to, in Pepsi's case, a 30% drop in global sales. What happened was a manufacturing plant in India, providing products only for that market, but branded in the normal Pepsi livery, was infected by pesticides. The resultant international health scare cost Pepsi dearly, but it was a very localized problem in the scheme of things. And then, well, the bigger you are, the more you're a target for different types of attack, sometimes legitimate, sometimes not. Walmart, as I've mentioned previously in this video already, are particular targets. Anything can attract publicity, good or bad, particularly in the online community. And so there have been stories on the web for years about Walmart in terms of low pricing, being at the expense of low pay. There have been various public relation flashpoints of one kind or another. All of this shows a complicated world is a world that's more crisis prone, perhaps. And then there are environmental issues. Well, there's lots of things we can put in here. Pollution, there's been high-profile cases of oil spills, for example, and oil leakages. Exxon Valdez, BP, they immediately spring to mind. Contamination problems, not just pesticides in India, but baby milk in China was a relatively recent scandal that attracted lots of global publicity. Public health can be classified under environmental at times. Diseases such as SARS in the Far East, foot and mouth disease in UK and Europe in general. Sometimes it's environmental activism that's the cause of the problem. Greenpeace and the Brent Spar crisis, for example, springs to mind from a few years ago. And it could be anything. It could be crises relating from materials used in products or their packaging. McDonald's and the styrofoam scandal, for example, is another notable case from the crisis management records. And then there are human organisational crises. Lots of things here. Misbehaviour or internal sabotage, global adverse publicity against Domino's pizza chain, when a couple of bored employees decided it was funny to post videos on YouTube of them contaminating food and then serving it to customers. There can be structural impediments and management failings. The fall of Barings Bank, when one rogue trader is left pretty much unmanaged and out of control, is a stark example of that. And there are lots of other cases where it's a decision-making or an error of judgment. The News Corporation phone hacking crisis is a recent example of that too. Human beings working for us, within us, key stakeholders generating a situation that becomes a crisis flashpoint. So there are, from natural disasters through terrorism to human organisational crises, all of these things can happen to us at any time. And the key point to remember in all of this is that they don't happen in isolation and they often have knock-on effects. Remember, we get disaster packages all of the time, as natural disasters such as Hurricane Katrina clearly and graphically show. So against all of this, what is crisis management? These things are often very unpredictable. Best we can do is perhaps manage them. As I see it, there are lots and lots of textbook definitions of crisis management. You buy your book, you take your choice. But there are two things that are crucial to me as characteristics. First of all, crisis management is about trying to predict and preferably prevent a crisis from happening in the first place. And secondly, accepting that, well, it may well happen anyway, and therefore trying to manage the situation in order to lessen its impact in the longer term. That's crisis management. Predicting it, and when and if it does happen, because we can't prevent it, mitigating the effects. And, well, why would we bother studying it? Why are we watching this video and anything else related to this course? 3 reasons for me. First of all, if you have an MBA or you're doing one, it's over-optimistic. We tell people how to think strategically, plan for the future, exploit strengths and opportunities in the marketplace, how to manage the finance far more effectively. But the vast majority of MBA programs totally ignore the alternative side of that. Oh dear, what do we do when something goes wrong? And that's my second point, really. A crisis is not something that might happen to your organisation. It will happen. And so a good reason for looking at crisis management is in order to make sure when it does happen, we're prepared. And finally, I think it's not just about surviving, but thriving too. What can be a crisis for one organisation can easily prove an opportunity for another. So, remember how the Chinese express this. Here in Chinese characters is the term crisis management. What I think is particularly interesting about this is that if we take those characters, which in the Chinese alphabet it's not an alphabet at all, they're concepts. If we label those concepts in English, what do we get? Threat and opportunity. And that's what crisis management should also be. In faced with a threat, not just surviving, but trying to turn it round and turn it into an opportunity, turning something negative into something very, very positive. That's crisis management too. So, how might we model this? Again, lots of textbooks out there, lots of courses. I think if we want a very simple framework that's really effective, if you're looking at a potential crisis that might happen, if you're trying to learn from one that's happened previous, there's a timeline. 3 distinct phases that any crisis goes through. There's the pre-crisis. We should all think of ourselves as being in the pre-crisis stage right now, looking around us to see what's going on and what could potentially flare up at any time. When it does happen, we enter the crisis stage itself. This is what most of the books on crisis management actually focus on, ignoring the first bit and whether you could have prevented it in the first place. So when it happens, when everything hits the fan, what do we do? How do we cope? How should we respond? How do we keep revising the response as we go? And when we come out of crisis, equally crucially, and again often neglected in the literature, the post-crisis stage, we should be always looking back. We should be a learning organisation. When faced with that crisis, what did we do well? What did we do not so well? What worked, what didn't work? This should be an iterative process, a cycle of crisis planning, because it will happen again. There will be another crisis one day. So where does this leave us? Well, we need to think the unthinkable every day in business. Constantly remind ourselves of all of the things that could be going wrong, particularly when we're not there. Become the doom merchant in your organisation if you want to be the crisis manager. We need to recognise that there are common characteristics such as low probability but high impact, or lack of clarity in cause and effect. Certain key characteristics common to all crises. Look out for signs of them in everyday events too. Think about the different types of crises that could happen. My list is very small. There's many, many other kinds that you could think of and probably have thought of while watching this. And remember, crisis management is about planning for things going wrong, accepting they will go wrong, and trying to turn things that go wrong into new opportunities. That's what it's really all about. And remember, always, always, always think about where your organisation is in the crisis management timeline. Thank you.